In this video, we're going to be talking about interpreting and communicating the results of statistical analysis. Specifically, what are things you should watch out for or pay attention to, be cautious about. So what should I talk about? We should talk about hypotheses, test procedures, test statistics, and conclusion. Hypotheses. We don't know whether specified in symbols or described in words. It is important that both the null and the alternative hypotheses be clearly stated. If you're using symbols to define the hypotheses, be sure to describe them in the context of the problem at hand. For example, mu equals the population mean of calorie intake. The test procedure. You should be clear about what test procedure was used. For example, large sample z-test for proportions, and why you think it was reasonable to use this procedure. The plausibility of any required assumptions should be satisfactorily addressed. The test statistic. You want to be sure to include the value of the test statistic and the p-value. Including the p-value allows a reader who may have chosen a different significance level to see whether she would have reached that same or a different conclusion. Conclusion and context. Never end the report of a hypothesis test with a statement, I reject, or I did not reject the or H sub O, H sub 0, or H sub naught. Always provide a conclusion that is in the context of the problem and that answers the original research question which the hypothesis test was designed to answer. Be sure you also indicate the level of significance used as a basis for the decision. So what are they talking about in published data? Hypotheses. What hypotheses are being tested? Are the hypotheses about a population mean, a population proportion, or some other population characteristic? The appropriate test procedure. Was the appropriate test used? Does the validity of the test depend on any assumptions about the sample or about the population from which the sample was selected? If so, are the assumptions reasonable? What was their p-value? So what is the p-value associated with the test? Was a significance level reported as opposed to simply reporting just the p-value? Is the chosen significance level reasonable? What about the conclusion being appropriate? Are the conclusions drawn consistent with the results of the hypothesis test? Lastly, our words to the wise, our cautions. Strong support for our null hypothesis. The result of a hypothesis test can never show strong support for the null hypothesis. Make sure that you don't confuse there is no reason to believe the null hypothesis is not true with the statement that there is convincing evidence that the null hypothesis is true. These are very different statements. Don't test for the sake of testing. If you have complete information for the population, don't carry out a hypothesis test. It should be obvious that no test is needed to answer questions about a population if you have complete information and don't need to generalize from a sample. But people sometimes forget this fact. For example, in an article on growth in the number of prisoners by state, the San Luis Obispo Tribune reported that California's numbers showed a statistically insignificant change, with 66 fewer prisoners at the end of 2000. Well, the use of the term statistically insignificant implies some sort of statistical inference, which is not appropriate when a complete accounting of the entire prison population is known. Perhaps the author confused statistical and practical significance, which brings us to our last warning. Did you include your assumptions? Don't confuse statistical significance with practical significance. When statistical significance has been declared, be sure to step back and evaluate the result in light of its practical importance. For example, we might be convinced that the proportion who responded favorably to proposed medical treatment is greater than 0.4. and the known proportion that responds favorably for the currently recommended treatments. But if our estimate of this proportion for the proposed treatment is 0.405, is this of any practical interest? Well, it might be if the proposed treatment is less costly or has fewer side effects. But in other cases, it may not be of any real interest. So we must always have our results be interpreted in context. And including our assumptions is a huge piece, and that is often forgotten. So make sure that you're including your assumptions and looking for those assumptions to be included.